All right, part two. The history of biology, the ancients. Quote, biologists cannot study their subject in abstraction from matter, since nature always acts for the sake of an end, which involves studying the relation of what is potentially something to its full realization. End quote. Aristotle, De Partibus Animalium. Gebser credits Aristotle as among the first in antiquity to display an unquestionable tendency toward the mental as opposed to mythic consciousness. It is not surprising, then, that Aristotle is widely seen as the originator of both the science and philosophy of biology. Whitehead, however, famously wrote that philosophy, quote, consists of a series of footnotes to Plato, end quote. And indeed, Aristotle is indebted to him, even where he disagrees. Whitehead credits Aristotle with correcting Plato's tendency to, quote, separate a static spiritual world from a fluent world of superficial experience, end quote. In Timaeus, Plato lays out a cosmology that is in many ways identical to what would today be called intelligent design. Nature is described as an artifact, and its designer is a divine craftsman who orders it just so as to bring about the most beauty and goodness possible. Aristotle, on the other hand, tried to find a less theological middle ground between atomistic reductionism and Plato's idealism, being careful not to scrub away nature's purposes in the process. Though he still made use of the metaphor of the craftsman to understand organic form, Aristotle recognized an important difference between artifact and organism. Quote, for the art is source and form of what comes to be, but in another, whereas the movement of nature is in what is coming to be, end quote. Aristotle here distinguishes the work of an artist from the nature of an organism by pointing out that artists shape their crafts from the outside, while organisms form from within. The core difference between Plato's understanding of life and Aristotle's is that Plato finds it necessary to import purpose into nature from beyond nature, i.e. by demiurgic design, while Aristotle finds it immanent in the movement of natural things themselves. It might be helpful here to introduce Aristotle's four atia. It's probably a terrible pronunciation. Atia, roughly translated as causes or reasons, for the sake of which every living organism exists. We will revisit these causes in a later section on Whitehead, where a slight reworking of them will aid our understanding of concrescence. The material cause is the potentiality necessary for motion, and the efficient cause, this motion's agent of initiation. The formal cause is movement directed toward an end, the final cause being the attainment of that end. We can now see how it is that Aristotle views the matter and form of a creature as intimately related, the former being the potential for the actualization of the latter. The difference between Aristotle's immanent and Plato's demiurgic understanding of teleology is extremely significant, as one or the other aspect of this distinction has influenced nearly every philosopher of biology since. The moderns. Quote, if one accepts the evolutionary perspective, attempts to discuss science or any other sort of conceptual activity become much more difficult, so difficult as to produce paralysis, end quote. David Hull. Charles Darwin, idolized by many contemporary materialists as the slayer of teleology and champion of the mechanistic paradigm, was a student of Paley, whose natural theology and argument from design can be traced back directly to Plato. Paley held that certain artifacts, including organisms, could not be explained without recourse to an intelligent artificer due to their obviously designed features. Darwin was inspired to respond to Paley, and so devised the theory of natural selection to explain how the apparent design of organisms could be the result of a purely mechanical process working over immense geological time. Darwin's response to Paley is difficult to disprove by weight of empirical evidence alone. But when one realizes the implicit assertion that both make, it becomes clear they are working from within the same paradigm. Both Darwin and Paley understood organisms to be nothing more than especially sophisticated machines. And there's a footnote. Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, is littered with observational evidence in support of the plausibility of his theory. No scientist can deny what Darwin found without first reworking his metaphysical assumptions. They differ only, Darwin and Paley, back to the text now, in the reasons given for this sophistication. Paley's argument from design required a transcendent deity for nature to have any purpose. Once Darwin called the logical necessity of that deity into question, the biological world was left sterile and purposeless, the result of chance necessity and an unfathomable amount of time. Footnote: time in this context is to be understood as the falsely spatialized time of the mental structure, as quantitative magnitude rather than qualitative intensity, as for the integral. Back to the text. Plato's demiurge had been vanquished, but his view of nature as an undirected flux remained. This is not the whole story, however. Darwin's was a biology constructed to comply with and reduced to Newtonian physics. Newton conceived of the universe in a way reminiscent of Plato. Nature was a giant clockwork machine constructed by God according to certain transcendent laws. Darwin was compelled to find a place for life within this framework, a framework Whitehead describes as the, quote, doctrine of imposed law, end quote. The only way to make room for life in Newton's universe was to erect a radical division between the contingency of biological evolution and the necessity of physical law. Footnote: we will later explore the difficulties this raised for an adequate thermodynamic account of living systems. While Darwin corrected the imbalance of Paley's Platonism with his evolutionary narrative, he failed to recognize that our knowledge of the laws of physics themselves must also be evolutionized, so to speak. There's a footnote, quote, a thoroughgoing evolutionary philosophy is inconsistent with materialism. The aboriginal stuff from which a materialistic philosophy begins is incapable of evolution, end quote. Alfred North Whitehead from Science and the Modern World. Back to the text. But because he was still firmly rooted within the mechanistic paradigm, Darwin could not understand how the tremendous degree of organization in the biosphere might arise without recourse to the arbitrarily imposed order of Newton's laws. Immanuel Kant, who died more than 50 years before Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, and who also lived in the shadow of Newton, heavily criticized the view that organisms can be understood as machines/artifacts. His view is reminiscent of Aristotle in that it affirms natural purposes without recourse to supernatural designers. Why the Anglo-American world paid so little attention to his critique of mechanistic biology is an historic curiosity whose complications are beyond our present investigation. Biologist Ernst Mayr remarked that Kant's acceptance of teleology greatly affected German evolutionists in the 19th century, but nonetheless he felt that any use of final causation in biology was doomed to failure. Mayr, nonetheless, felt that any use of final causation in biology was doomed to failure. We can only assume that Mayr had other ideological commitments that prevented him from investigating Kant's understanding of teleology in more depth. We turn now to explore Kant's account of life, one that would almost 2 centuries later resurface in the scientific guise of Varela's theory of autopoiesis. Part 3, the organization of the living. A. Teleology as a regulative principle. Quote, an organized being is then not a mere machine, for that has merely moving power, but it possesses in itself formative power of a self-propagating kind, which it communicates to its materials, though they have it not of themselves. It organizes them, in fact, and this cannot be explained by the mere mechanical faculty of motion. End quote. Immanuel Kant from the Critique of Judgment. Part 3 coming up.